Of course, racial issues had never been absent from American politics. From the 1860s to the 1960s, the Democratic Party in the South presented itself as the protector of white power. Of course, with Lyndon Johnson's support for civil rights and especially voting rights for African Americans in the mid 1960s, that changed. And the Democratic Party, which had gained many black supporters as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, now presented itself as the protector of black rights. Likewise, for much of the 1800s and into the 1900s, the Democratic Party in the North primarily um, protected and promoted the rights and interests of immigrants in urban areas, whereas the Republicans, inheriting the know nothing anti immigrant position and a suspicion of some Whigs for Catholics, both for religious and political reasons, um, were suspicious of many immigrants. All they did, except many German immigrants who opposed slavery in the mid 1800s. Um, and of course, the Democrats found new groups of immigrants to support and seek the support of, following Lyndon Johnson's reopening of America to immigration from all parts of the world in 1965, partly to allow more people to escape to America from communist countries. But this increasingly made the Democratic Party a party of identity politics, um, saying only they could protect various minority groups. The Republican Party, which had begun, at least for many of its members, to protect the rights of African Americans, or rather to give them some rights, um, following Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, increasingly presented itself as a protector of kind of old stock, traditional American identity. So the racial divide that seemed to increase, but probably simply became more visible following Barack Obama's election, it was not entirely new. But again, was something that became more obvious, more salient. Um, another um, important point in a seventh two-party system is a real distrust of the media and of government, which again is not new. During the 1960s, much of the left came to distrust the government because of its managing of the war in Vietnam. Likewise, many conservatives came to distrust the media for its opposition to the war. Many conservatives began to distrust at least some parts of the government because of the Supreme Court's um, separation of church and state, taking prayer and mandatory Bible readings out of public schools, for example. Um, and of course, Richard Nixon undermined many people's confidence and trust in the government. In the 1980s, President Reagan said government is not the solution to our problems, it is the problem. Um, and in the 1990s, Bill Clinton's impeachment further undermined people's faith in the government. Um, and with the development first of conservative talk radio and later the growth of Fox News, created in part deliberately to be a counterbalance to the more liberal mainstream media by a man who'd originally been a supporter of Richard Nixon and saw how he was treated by the media. Led many liberals to distrust the media too, as a very outspoken um, uh, right wing commentary developed and became influential. And in the distrust of the media from both sides, he distrusted the government from both sides, um, continued to grow in the 21st century, especially as the internet um, removed many of the gatekeepers from kind of political discourse so that um, anyone could present some information on the internet. And thanks to Facebook in particular, but other social media, spread ideas quickly, with very little fact checking. Um, and likewise, both parties increasingly played on identity politics, So more and more, each political party seemed integral to many people's identity. So that they came to distrust and even despise members of the other party. So that by 2016, the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton could describe the supporters of Donald Trump as a basket of deplorables. Earlier, Barack Obama had dismissed many of his detractors as people clinging to guns and religion out of desperation. And on the other hand, President Donald Trump has dismissed many longtime government employees as part of a deep state conspiring against him, and dismissed much of the mainstream media as fake news. And while distrust of the media, and to be fair, dishonesty in the media, and certainly a partisan bias in the media, dates back to the late 1700s, or probably much longer, has become perhaps more intense. And certainly much easier to spread very simplified political ideas. Although, to be sure this is not new, the Sedition Acts of 1798 were an attempt by the Federalists to attack what they saw as fake news spread by the Democratic Republican press. But in today, information of all kinds is spread more easily, and some might say it is more shallow, as so much is conveyed in a simple image on Facebook, 140-character message on Twitter. Even people who still hear their sound bites on the news are hearing a sound bite. Whereas during World War I, Woodrow Wilson had recruited 4-minute men to give 4-minute talks about why Americans needed to support the war effort. And 4 minutes was chosen because that was believed to be the length of the human attention span at the time. Today it's believed that 9 seconds is the maximum length that a human will listen to political or other ideas expressed in what is called a sound bite because it is so short. Again, a tribalism, a partisanship is not new, but has become much more intense, as has, again, a distrust of the media and the government. One really big shift in just the past few years has been both parties turning away from generally a consensus supporting free trade towards a more protectionist point of view. Now, traditionally, the Democratic Party, dating all the way back to its roots in the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, had opposed high tariffs, originally because they were seen as hurting the farmers who made up the majority of the Jeffersonian voters and the supporters of Andrew Jackson and so forth. Pardon me. Whereas Franklin Roosevelt had supported low tariffs to try to stimulate world trade during the Depression. Democrats did become a bit more suspicious of free trade as union members who worried that their jobs might be shipped overseas became a bigger and bigger part of the Democratic Party. But even they often saw free trade as a good thing because after World War II, that mainly meant that American manufacturers could be shipped overseas as foreigners bought American-made goods. So that benefited in both the factory owners and the factory workers. And also helped to kind of cement America's dominance and the dominance of our economic system in general, at a time when promoting the idea of our economic system was so important during the Cold War. Republicans had traditionally supported high tariffs, believing that protected factory owners and factory workers, which was probably true when the Republican Party was formed in the mid-1800s, and inherited that idea from the Whigs, who in turn sort of inherited it from the Federalists. But after World War II, many Republicans, again, especially the more moderate and liberal ones, who dominated the Republican Party in the fifth two-party system, in many ways were still very influential early in the sixth two-party system, saw free trade as a way to promote American business by letting us export our goods, and again spread the American way of life in the Cold War. Of course, President George H.W. Bush negotiated NAFTA during his presidency, removing most trade barriers between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Bill Clinton, as a moderate Democrat, finished the deal, again, greatly promoting trade within America. Although there were those who worried that, as Ross Perot put it, there would be a great sucking sound of American jobs moving south of the border, as a Mexican worker could be paid what in Mexico was a pretty good wage, while still being paid much less than what a union member or even a non-union worker in America might have to get. And many American jobs did go to Mexico in the 1990s and later to China and some other parts of Asia in the early 20th century. Um, Again, most mainstream politicians supported free trade, which unquestionably made the country and the world as a whole richer. But a lot of that wealth seemed to end up concentrated in the hands of the major investors in the major corporations, the actual wealth often not seeming to trickle down to the average American. Although, in some ways, the average American's purchasing power increased as manufactured goods became much cheaper. Um, but in 2016, there was a huge shift in both parties, as Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, who had worried about America's trade deficit since the rise of Japan in the late 1970s and the 1980s, proposed raising tariffs to protect American industry and jobs. Likewise, many of the working class supporters of Bernie Sanders wanted to return to protectionism and to protect American jobs. Um, and just as Hillary Clinton adopted many of Bernie Sanders' ideas for a big, active left wing government, such as a higher minimum wage, more health care, and other issues, she shifted from being a big supporter of free trade, who, as Secretary of State, had helped negotiate the Trans Pacific Partnership, a big free trade area between the U.S., many Asian countries, I think some South American ones as well, suddenly changed to oppose further integration of the world economy. So both parties may, at least among some of their most outspoken leaders, but many of their supporters obviously made a shift towards protectionism. And that is a really big shift in contrast to really the entire post World War II period. Um, and so a seventh two-party system does seem to be developing with ever greater distrust of the government, ever greater tribalism, as people's identities become more tied up with their political affiliation than ever. And particularly that means a disdain, even a hate for members of the other political party. That in turn inspires a populism on both sides, as leaders of both parties, as politicians have always done, but in perhaps a more outspoken way than usual, promise their supporters what they want to hear in what is popular rather than what is necessarily practical. And that can be said, I think, of both parties. In particular, both parties have pretty much abandoned the idea that at one point was central to both of them and remained at least part of Republican rhetoric into the early 20th century, but which moderate Democrats supported too. The idea the government ought to balance its budget and find money to pay for what it's going to do. But in practice, that has largely been abandoned for some time and seems completely gone today. Now, it's true, our money has been since the early 1970s based fully on the faith and credit of the U.S. government. The dollar's worth as much as people trust the U.S. government to make it worth, so perhaps we can print unlimited quantities. But it seems like at some point that that might be a problem. But I'm no economist. So we seem to be entering a new phase in our political system, one that many people see as a time of crisis, but people have seen crises throughout our history. Certainly, the two-party system has changed in many ways. The modern Republican Party is not exactly the party of Lincoln. The modern Democratic Party is not much like the democracy of Andrew Jackson. Although there are some things we can trace from the earliest days of our two parties to today. Um, and beyond the early Republicans and the early Democrats, one can only guess at what Alexander Hamilton or Henry Clay might think of politics today. Um, but those are some things to consider as we look back on the political history and, of course, other parts of the history of our country since even before its founding, as we watch politics and current events moving forward from today.